Thanks, everybody, for being here today. My name is Ryan Scrivens. The co-authors on this paper are Wojciechowski, Tiana, Gaudette, and Richard Frank. The title is Examining the Persisting and Desisting Online Posting Behaviors of Violent and Nonviolent Right-Wing Extremists. This is a paper that was sitting under review for 8 months. Yesterday, I finally got the revise and resubmit. I was glad it wasn't reject right before.
Which journal?
TPV. They've been dragging the piss.
I got TPV too, so I should yell at John.
I try, but he ignored me. So like most of us, violent extremists and terrorists often leave a digital footprint online, including, but certainly not limited to, right-wing extremists. Just as a couple recent examples, Tarrant, who we all know, live streamed his attack online, as well as announced his intentions online and produced a manifesto there. The Buffalo shooter live streamed parts of his attack online, as well as wrote and posted a manifesto on 4chan citing the Great Replacement theory. In each of these cases, many researchers, practitioners, and policymakers have raised critical questions about whether such individuals can be identified online before their acts of engagements offline. But despite these ongoing efforts, surprisingly few empirical analyses have actually identified which online users have, in fact, engaged in violent extremism offline, and then assessed their online behaviors. And even fewer analyses have been able to identify the differences between the online posting behaviors of those who share extremist views with those who are violent or nonviolent. So I guess in simple terms, a vast majority of the literature overwhelmingly focuses on identifying and examining extremists online, which I understand, and not those who adhere to extremist views but are violent as well. Further, little is empirically known in terrorism and extremism online research in general about what makes up the posting behaviors of those who persist in their behavior or desist in their behavior over time. And even less is known in this space when you start trying to draw comparisons between violent and nonviolent extremists. This is an important oversight for several reasons, just two. It's unclear, from an academic perspective at least, what these users are posting as a desist or as a, I don't say disengage, but they post less and eventually stop over time. Are they becoming more extreme or are they becoming more moderate? We don't know. Are they trying to mobilize others to violent extremism as they desist, or are they renouncing their extremism? Again, we don't know. And distinguishing between these two different poster types, I guess I'll call them, persisters and desisters, may facilitate a better understanding of users' transitions away from specific online platforms, either whether it's their behavior or whether they're moving from different platforms, and especially when you start thinking about violent or nonviolent users. So for this particular project, we examine the online posting behavioral patterns of both violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists within a small space of a larger space, so a subforum of a larger forum, as we all know, Stormfront. We looked at the open access content. If you want to ask me any questions about the data after, I'd love to chat about it. I just don't have that much time. So what we did here is we investigated if violent right-wing extremists are differentially active online compared to their non-violent counterpart during the beginning, middle, and end of what we'll call their observed posting activity. And this was really expanding on prior work. I've used this data, some of you know, for quite a few publications. This one, we're trying to differentiate the posting behaviors of people who persist in their behavior and people who desist. What does that look like? I was told not to talk too much about data collection sampling, which I won't, but it's a four-stage process. The first includes a customized web crawler that automatically collects information. This particular sample, so a subforum of Stormfront, it was Stormfront Canada, comprised of approximately 125,000 posts made by approximately 7,000 users between 2001 and 2017. And for those who aren't familiar with this research, you're probably wondering how the hell I was able to identify violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists. So a former violent extremist who was actively involved in the North American right-wing extremist movement reviewed under my, presence a list of user names in this particular subforum. And they essentially picked out those who, based on their experience, fit the definition of violent or nonviolent. And again, we can talk about all these things later. I don't have a lot of time. But what I will say is that each time that this former identified a user of interest, they were asked in an enormous amount of detail why this particular person was identified as either violent or nonviolent. They were also asked to provide examples of the violence or the activities. As well as I wanted to get a sense of what their connections were to these particular individuals to see how strong of a connection they had with them. I certainly trusted this former, but I wanted to be as rigorous as I could given the methodological approach. So again, this was essentially to do the best that I could to verify the authenticity of those identified. And there's clearly limitations with this. I've talked till I'm blue in the face about them, and I can talk about them if you want later. But this particular exercise resulted in 49 violent right-wing extremists identified and 50 non-violent right-wing extremists. So the next stage was identification of a particular sample. So users were then distinguished whether they met certain criteria of what constituted persisting or desisting in posting behaviors. And this resulted in 4 simple groups. You could have been a violent desister, you could have been a violent persister, you could have been a non-violent desister, or a non-violent persister. So to be categorized, for example, as a persister, violent or non-violent, the user could not have gone dormant during the study period. So during the period of time that we analyzed, they could not have stopped posting, essentially. To be categorized, on the other hand, as a desister, users had to end the study period in the state of dormancy, meaning they had to stop, and they had to have stopped for at least 24 consecutive months. And this decision was made because some of our prior work has looked at and tried to kind of validate this measure of dormancy, and 24 months seemed to be the sweet spot in terms of what we could classify or constitute as dormancy. I mean, there's lots of ways you can rig this up, but we want 24 consecutive months that people didn't post. Again, there's problems with that too, and we can talk about it later. But the last was about the sampling post. So users' posting patterns were analyzed at the beginning, middle, and end of their observed posting behavior in the subform. So this was essentially carried out by pinpointing each user's exact moments that they posted during the first month, the last month, and then we took the median month. And think of it as 3 buckets of data. But also, the users were only included in the sample, so the violent or non-violent users, so that's 99 users, if they posted during 3 separate months. If they posted in 2, they were eliminated. If they posted in 5, they're included, 3, you get it. So this resulted in a sample of close to 2,000 posts across all 3 time periods. Lastly, around the coding scheme. So a reasonable starting place to do this kind of exploratory work was to draw from some of the prior work I've done on coding indicators of extremism. So I did a content analysis essentially using analyzing the sample of data that I just discussed for right-wing extremist ideologies and violent mobilization efforts. So the unit of analysis was the content of each post relative to the other indicator categories. So in other words, each observation or post that I analyzed could have received multiple codes. So a post containing anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic language would have been coded for both. It wouldn't have been one or the other, it could have been both. And just very briefly, in terms of ideological posts, they were coded based on whether they used comments that detailed or referenced known right-wing extremist ideologies. It was developed essentially from drawing from Southern Poverty Law Center's ideology codebook. I augmented it a little bit, or I wouldn't say rigged it, but I included other categories and explained in the paper why I did. And that included 10 binary codes. And then mobilization posts were coded if a user was discussing or encouraging others to prepare in acts of violent extremism. And this was derived from FBI's homegrown violent extremist mobilization indicators. And this resulted in 23 binary codes. So the key results. So the first was around this idea of this prevalence of persister posters. So it was quite clear that these particular posters, regardless of whether they were violent or not, comprise the largest proportion of users in the sample. So a noticeably larger proportion of persisters, so 42, were found compared to desisters. There were only 22. This finding comes as a surprise because researchers overwhelmingly, including my own, found that most who post in right-wing extremist spaces actually desist in posting behavior over time. Our findings actually align with some other work, other work I've done actually, that suggests that users tend to persist in extremist behavior over time. And this is a finding that's supported by some conceptual work, some of the earlier work by Wyman and others, conceptualizing right-wing extremist spaces online as hornet's nests or lone actor incubators. Our findings for this particular project seem to align with that. So this is hypothetical, but perhaps the persisters in our study were embedded in right-wing extremist groups offline, and in turn they had a greater stake in participating in online discussions for recruitment and radicalization, for example. Our findings may also be explained in part by the fact that the former who was able to identify users in the study may have been able to do so because of some prominence of those who they identified as violent or nonviolent, so they're active in their right-wing extremist circle. Our definition of desister may have been too narrow, as persisters may have eventually desisted, but their data were not tracked over a long enough period of time to identify such a change. But this requires further exploration. And again, this is a very exploratory study. The second is around this idea of active persisters. Persisters were generally the most active user type across observed posting behaviors, whether it was the middle, or the beginning, middle, or end. Whether you break it down by average number of posts, average number of ideological posts, or number of mobilization posts. Persisters were generally the most active user type, from beginning, middle, or end. So just to illustrate, so the nonviolent persisters, who made up the largest proportion of users in the sample, were among the most active posting group. They were also among the highest in ideological posts and mobilization posts across time periods. In other words, they were prolific posters who were outspoken about extremist beliefs and made numerous efforts to mobilize extremism. Again, this is making assumptions here, but it is likely the case that the nonviolent persisters were unafraid to be active online because they weren't engaging in violence offline. This finding comes as little surprise based on some of the work I've done because research does suggest that the online behaviors of nonviolent extremists tends to reflect one of an ideologue. So they post a much larger proportion of ideological and mobilization message than violent users, as well as people who post in the space in general. Importantly, these nonviolent persisters may perceive their role in and engage in the right-wing extremists as ideologues, essentially providing the conceptual tools for those to engage in violent extremism after, as has been found in empirical research. Violent persisters, who are also among the large proportion of users in the sample, also tended to post with the most frequency during each posting period, and by extension were the most active compared to all other sample groups. Yet they were actually among the least active in posting ideological or mobilization posts. And this is because their level or propensity of violence, because of their level or propensity towards violence, it may be the case that they were apprehensive about posting too many ideological or mobilization messages that could draw unwarranted attention to them. They're engaging in violent extremism offline. I assume they don't want to be drawing too much heat to themselves online. To some extent, the set of findings comes as a surprise. So on the one hand, it's unsurprising that violent persisters were among the least active in posting ideological and mobilization content, as research does suggest that those actively involved in violent extremism offline tend to be concerned that law enforcement and anti-racists, for example, may be watching them. And some of the work on the ground I've done, formers have told me they modify their online behavior because they're concerned with that, interviewing violent extremists. And previous research on extremist posting patterns also suggests that violent right-wing extremists tend to post fewer ideological and mobilization posts than their nonviolent counterpart. On the other hand, though, it's a surprise. It was quite a surprise to me that the violent persisters were actually the most active in general, because research has found that these individuals are less active online in general than the nonviolent users, as well as the general folks who post on there. But regardless, our results align on some of our more recent work that suggests, as well as this work, that the presumed assumption that there's a presumed connection between posting frequency and risk of extremist violence, it's not so straightforward. There's a lot more nuance, and this is a question of policy relevance for future work. And then this idea of unassumed desisters. Desisters were generally the least active user type across their observed posting periods. So to illustrate, violent desisters, who made up the smallest proportion in the sample, tended to post with the least amount of frequency. They generally posted fewer ideological messages than the other groups, and they posted noticeably more mobilization messages, which I found particularly interesting. They also posted more messages, ideological messages, and mobilization messages at the end of their posting activity. So on their way out, they were going hard, if you will. So in other words, while violent desisters generally posted, they were kind of low-profile posters who made few messages in general and ideological messages in particular, much of the content, surprisingly, was encouraging others to mobilize to violent extremism. They also became more active online generally and posting mobilization messages specifically than other users at the tail end before they desisted. I don't have enough time to give an example, but perhaps the violent desisters were making last-ditch efforts to mobilize as they desisted in posting behavior. I don't know. They may also the offline could have been a key role. They may be engaging in violence, and in turn, they didn't see their utility in the movement to be promoting others. Sorry. They may have also played a key role offline, so engaging in violence, that was perhaps their role. And in turn, they didn't see the utility of posting other messages that promoted. This doesn't make sense. Anyway, perhaps their roles or involvement in the movement offline provided them with the connection, status, and sense of identity that the more active offline users seek through online communication, as been found in previous work. It may also be, like I've alluded to before, that law enforcement were monitoring their on and offline presence, so they're a little concerned with that. They may not have desisted by their own accord, too. They may have been in prison. We just don't know. There's a lot of assumptions. We have this data, but we don't really know what's going on in the background. It's highly speculative and requires further exploration. And lastly, the non-violent desisters were amongst the smallest sample, least active. And while they posted few mobilization efforts, they post a lot of ideological content. Perhaps they saw their role in the movement as spreading the message to others. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable spreading mobilization messages because they were just getting their feet wet in the movement. But again, this is really exploratory and requires further exploration. Thank you.